If you came across this little chibi avatar vibing out in the wild like this, do you think you'd be able to clock right away that this is not a live 2D model? In fact, there isn't any kind of motion tracking at all. I'm moving solely by the power of the mouse. The mouse, which controls everything. Stop it, I'm gonna sneeze! Achoo! Hello everyone, my name is Kippy Cringe Devil. I'm a PNG tuber on Twitch and sometimes an artist, and I made both this model and the chibi model you just saw from scratch, all set up and rigged in RahiTuber, which is a powerful little tool for PNG tubing that I've been obsessed with since last year. Recently, RahiTuber has started to have more eyeballs on it than ever, which is super exciting to me as someone who has adored it since I found it. I've been yelling from the rooftops since I debuted this model about how much I want everyone interested in PNG tubing to check this software out. Being this deep into my 6-ish month or so hyperfixation on RahiTuber and PNG tuber rigging and such, I found myself some tricks and techniques that have resulted in some pretty neat accomplishments when it comes to interesting PNG tubing, just by combining RahiTuber's physics with mouse tracking magic in order to animate my models. Most recently, I set up an entire chibi model from start to finish live, and the result came out pretty cute. The VODs are still there and they're still around on my YouTube channel as resources, but they are a little bit of a mess now because there were still some aspects of RahiTuber that it didn't quite have polished yet in terms of my understanding, and I am a chronic yapper, if you didn't know. Originally, I planned to just cut those VODs into one long all-in-one tutorial, but I have never really gotten into making videos like this before, and oh man, I underestimated how much I would want to dig into it and edit things. Since RahiTuber started catching on while I was kind of in the middle of working on it, I realized I really wanted the final product to be thorough, since I have so many ideas to share with you all. But it's difficult to explain to somebody who hasn't used the software before. We gotta start somewhere, right? There's also the fact that since my tutorial stream started, Rahisaurus had several epiphanies and gave us some pretty big updates with some new features that I considered game-changing enough to record entirely new guides for. The tutorial series is still based on that model that we made on stream, and I'll be talking about that process. But rather than this just being a step-by-step for how I made that model, it's more that that model is now an example for the concepts that I'm really trying to understand and explain to you in depth. The way that I've been using and setting things up in RahiTuber gets a little bit wild, a little bit complicated, but I think a huge selling point of RahiTuber is that it's actually only as complicated as you feel like making it. You can have a talking animated avatar with only one layer if you want, and then you can choose to upgrade it with fancier features like physics, toggles, and my favorite right now, mouse tracking. So with that in mind, I decided to split the entire tutorial into 3 parts. Each part, which I'll be referring to as levels throughout the tutorial series from now on, will be based around one version of our tutorial model that I've made. We're starting today with the base knowledge you'll need to be able to get started, and then we'll get into the basics of RahiTuber, starting from installation and all of the important settings, and then the absolute fundamentals when it comes to how RahiTuber can animate a model. So then at the end of the video, we'll have enough information to make this level 1 RahiTuber model, which is a 1-layer setup that'll blink, talk, and even have a tiny bit of idle and bouncing motion to it to make it interesting for you to use. To more directly tell you what's ahead, I'll show you the topics I have in mind for each level of the tutorial. Level 1 will cover installation, general settings, audio settings, adding a layer, layer settings like talking, blinking, and transform, individual motion, aka bouncing and idle motion, capture in OBS, and a bonus little exercise that you can add to the simple 1-layer model to actually introduce you a little bit to physics. Level 2 will cover layer separation, adding multiple layers, physics part 1, which is the motion inherit chain and all of the settings there besides weight direction, and states part 1, simple types of states. Level 3 will cover mouse tracking, states part 2, advanced toggles, animated layers, tint and blend modes, importing and exporting models to other systems, physics part 2, weight direction, and anything extra that I discover and want to share between now and then. Everything new that I teach is built off of what we've learned in past episodes, so by the time we get to level 3, we'll have all the knowledge to be able to use physics and mouse tracking together to make something really cool. I'll show you an example in the googly eyes that I set up. Because I promised, In the description, you'll find links to the RahiTuber itch.io page, my socials, and Rahisaurus' socials. Be sure to check them out as you listen to the video. Rahisaurus has some clips and tutorial content as well, and it can definitely be helpful to see what the developer themselves is doing with the software. In my series, I'm doing my best to explain everything to you in the way that my brain understands it, but admittedly, especially when it comes to something like physics, my understanding might not be perfect. I've been trying to work on a lot of my RahiTuber stuff live, so follow me on Twitch as well. I'm storing as much as I can of highlights related to building RahiTuber stuff, so you can use those as a resource. But if I'm on top of things by the time this comes out, I should have them on YouTube as well in my VODs playlist, ? Some of those videos will be showing older versions of RahiTuber throughout, but for the most part, most of the basic concepts I'm talking about are going to be the same. My understanding of the physics has improved a lot since then though, so in levels 2 and 3, my physics explanations are mostly new. So if you do want to use that more real-time content to follow along, just keep in mind that some of those things I'm saying might not be fully accurate, or at least they might not match up with what I'm saying now in this series. I also share a lot of sneak peeks and experimental silly content on Blue Sky specifically right now, so you can also find some resources and information there. I'm going to link that below. And last plug here, I promise. But Rahisaurus and I are both members of the Pink Fuzzy Bunnies unofficial stream team, which I helped in founding this year. It's made up of lots of cool and silly streamers who enjoy doing out-of-the-box stuff with their streams as well. Several members have actually very recently started RahiTuber builds of their own. You can find everybody in the card link below. With all that yapping out of the way, let's get into the basics so we can get this ball rolling. Finally!
RahiTuber.
So since we want to start at the very beginning, let's talk a little bit about what PNG tubing actually is. Chances are, if you've clicked on this video, you are probably already somewhat familiar with the concept, but at its very core, PNG tubing is puppeting a virtual avatar to represent yourself by using a software that will manipulate the visibility of images or layers to emulate talking. There are a lot of tools out there for PNG tubing, and they vary greatly in the effects that you can achieve and the way that they're used. Some really popular tools I can think of off the top of my head are ViadoTube Mini, PNG Tuber Plus, and Reactive by Fugitech. And some of the lesser known tools and methods of PNG tubing that I've looked into before are things like Honk, LandyTube, and a new tool called PNG Tube Remix by The Mime, which is a remix, for lack of a better word, of the PNG Tuber Plus tool, which is no longer supported by its dev, using open source code and adding a bunch of extra features. But you can even run a PNG Tuber with only OBS plugins like Scale to Sound and Image React, pictured here in this setup by Shock. Each of these tools vary in complexity. You can go for a very bare bones setup with just 2 layers that toggle on and off, or you can set up a hierarchy of layers to create some really advanced effects. The beauty of RahiTuber is that RahiTuber can do both. Beyond just that, there are a ton of reasons why I switched to RahiTuber and never looked back. I won't get into the details of those benefits right now because this video is already going to be pretty long, and we'll actually get to see all those benefits in practice throughout this tutorial. Some key notes to consider though: RahiTuber is super lightweight. It hardly impacts my CPU and GPU at all, even when I'm running multiple models and capturing them all in OBS. The dev, Rahisaurus, is insanely responsive when it comes to helping people with trying to figure something out, or addressing bugs, or adding new features that are suggested by the community. RahiTuber is insanely customizable, whether we're talking about physics, mouse tracking, idle movement, reactive to sound. You can directly control how much those things affect the model by inputting the number yourself into the UI. And that high level of customizability is what has made it possible for me to do such interesting things with PNG tubing. Hello, what's up? It's me, VoiceOver Kip again. It's actually VoiceOver Kip again because this is the most recent edit I'm making. I am showing you right now, actively showing you, version 13.5, which is the newest one as of today when I'm recording. And I'm only re-recording the beginning of this part of the tutorial just to show you what your initial load should look like. So if you downloaded through... Oh, wait. I forgot to talk about download and install. We're doing that first. Hi, it's voiceover Kip again. We're going to talk about how to download and install RahituBer. So the first thing you're going to do, you're going to head to the itch.io page, linked in the description, to find the download link and information. The software is available for free, but you can contribute with a donation if you'd like to. RahiSource has provided us some instructions and tips for installation here on this page, and they're very important, so I recommend checking here before you do anything. RahiSource says you can download and install the folder manually from this page, but they recommend that you use the itch.io official app for your install. itch.io makes it very easy and clean, and itch.io can verify the download so you don't get potentially yelled at by Windows Defender. If you did decide to download it manually, note that since RahituBer is free and signing in an executable is not, it isn't signed, and so your Windows or your antivirus might try to block it, block the exe specifically. You can usually bypass this by selecting Run Anyway when prompted. If you're having any trouble beyond that when it comes to your firewall or your Defender being Angie, I definitely recommend using the itch.io app method instead. You can launch the program through the itch.io window in the app, or you can go into the folder wherever it is and find the rahituber_64.exe or just rahituber.exe if you don't have a 64-bit system. That'll be the executable for your RahituBer program. I recently switched to the itch.io app method instead and moved everything there.
Myself
Right, so we're here, we're ready. We've run the program, rahituber.exe, and this is what it'll look like for you when it loads up. We get these cute icons up here that RahituBer gave to us in a recent update. You can choose to keep these if you want, but you could also go into advanced settings and find the setting, I don't remember what it's called. Exposed. I'm recording this before I do the video. The layer set UI setting is what you want. And there's an option for default. My bad. No, there's an option for legacy, menus, and buttons. Legacy is the old version. So if you're watching any of my older tutorial VODs, you'll see that version. I, throughout the rest of the tutorial, will be mostly using the menus option because I like that better. So I'm a switchy over, but you can use what you want, depending on what you like personally. I'm pretty sure all the same options are there, but if you're seeing me do something and you can't find the button for it, just try switching to the menus option to follow along with me. Okay, goodbye. Voiceover Kip is leaving, and now we're going back to normal voiceover Kip, who was doing this in, I think, version 13.4, but it might be slightly earlier than that. Either way, it'll be definitely after the UI update that we had. So the file UI should be the same, and I think that's the biggest change in terms of what we're visually seeing. If there's some settings that you have that you're not seeing in this part of the tutorial, those settings will be things that we probably cover in later levels anyway, so don't worry too much, but let me know in the comments if I missed anything. Before I really got into adding our layer and the sprites and the settings for it, I decided to talk about the more general settings we can find around the UI, including the advanced settings and this layer set menu. So we can see under File, we've got New, Open, Save, Save As, Make Portable, and Reload. Make Portable is actually an exciting new feature that was just added where we can export the layer set to be imported to other people's RahituBers, aka you can share your models. We've got this layer menu where we see new layer, new folder, and remove all layers. And then the states menu with edit states and remove all state. Our global settings are not really going to have an effect until we have something to see, but this is how you would globally change your position, rotation, and scale. And then all the way down here, we have our audio input settings. We're not going to mess with it until we have a layer loaded in so we can see the effects as we change the settings. You have some more buttons at the very top of the window that I ignored initially, like the close menu, which you can also do with the escape key or right click. We have the pop-out menu option, which is going to bring out a window that you can move around. It will also hide the window from your OBS capture, which can be useful. And you can click that dock menu to put it back. We have a help tab here for some notes from Rahisaurus, as well as an FAQ link and some information about the software. And last, but certainly not least, we have this advanced settings menu, which you can move around as you need to. We'll go through each of these settings one by one, and I'll explain them the best that I can. Menu start is pretty straightforward. This will just make it so that the menu doesn't or does start when you open RahiTuber. VSync is something graphics related. You'll be familiar with it if you've ever had to adjust your graphics in a video game for potato purposes. I think I just leave it on. I don't notice a huge difference personally on my monitor, but you might want it on. We have the always on top toggle, which isn't going to do anything in our screen right now, but what it would do is keep the RahiTuber window on top. Name windows separately. This is a very useful toggle to have on. What it means is your RahiTuber window, when you hover over in the taskbar, you'll see that the window is named now RahiTuber dash and then whatever your layer set is named. So in this case, ours would be RahiTuber dash Chibi Simple Tutorial. This is basically only really going to matter if you're ever trying to capture more than one RahiTuber instance or window in OBS, though it also helps to be able to reference if you do have multiple Rahi windows open for whatever reason. I do often want to have multiple models captured in OBS at the same time so I can toggle between them, so this is a very useful setting for me. So we can get into these appearance settings. This theme is pretty straightforward. It'll switch the colors of things. And here's menus. We know what it does though. Turning on the transparent toggle will make your whole window transparent except for your avatar. Normally I do have that turned on, but I didn't turn it on for this part of the tutorial because I didn't want to show the mess in the background. You can also set a background color though. You can change it to anything you'd like. In some cases you might want to have a green screen behind your model, and then in this case you can set your green right there. There are a couple more settings in here that aren't going to do anything until we actually have layers showing, like this layer bound setting and mouse tracking and use spout 2. So I'm going to skip over explaining them. We'll learn as we go what exactly they do as we need to toggle those settings off and on. Show FPS is pretty straightforward. It's just going to put a little FPS frame per second indicator in the corner when the menu is not showing. And then changing the UI scale will, change the scale of the UI. The check for updates button will make something appear kind of over here in the UI. I think it's like a little flashing dot when there's an update available on itch.io. And once again, a lot of these settings are not going to apply to us yet, and I don't want to waste too much time, so we'll adjust them later as they become relevant. And here we are back in our empty RahiTuber. We'll have this layer added, and when we don't have the minimal layers option toggled on in advanced settings, this is what we will see. By default, we'll already have things like blinking and a talking effect and some idle animation. Right now we don't have anything on the layer and no sprites, but you can see it with that little pink dot. That's the pivot point of this layer. So now first things first, we're going to go in, click that question mark under the idle and add our idle sprite. And right here I'm just using this plain sprite to demonstrate the default settings that we've got already on this layer. At this point I decided I wanted to show the difference between the default layers and the minimal layers, so I deleted the layer that we had set here and toggled on create minimal layers, then added a new one. As soon as I expand the layer, we can see that we don't have all of those defaults there. So we don't have by default blinking and talking, and we don't have any kind of motion. We're just standing right still. So now using this minimal layer, I'll go one by one through these settings. So right now I'm hovering over swap when talking. When we toggle that, we get to see that talk sprite option. And here, as soon as we pick our talking sprite, right away we actually see that we can talk. We're swapping the sprites when the program detects us talking. You can see the talk threshold is going a little bit crazy. That's because we need to edit our audio settings. La, la, la. So when we come down here to audio input, this is going to be very important for us to adjust to get the effects that we want. It's also very important to be aware that your settings for your mic and your voice are probably going to be super duper different. A lot could change depending on what filters your mic already has, how loud you normally speak, etc. My mic, a Blue Yeti, comes with its own software, some kind of Logitech G-Hub type thing, and I think it turns the gain all the way up or something like that. Anyway, RawHeTuber thinks I'm being super loud even when I'm speaking at a normal volume. It kind of works because it's still detecting when I'm not talking and then passing that talk threshold, which is what indicates to the layer when the sprite needs to be swapped. However, it's very sensitive and it thinks I'm going way past this max level every time I speak. The max level is probably going to be the setting that you want to mess around with the most. It'll have the most effect. When I drag it down, you can see that my talk threshold, the audio indicator, becomes more sensitive. When I drag it all the way up, it becomes less sensitive. And you can kind of see that I'm not hitting the talk threshold, the maximum talk threshold, as much when I have it at that high value of 5. So I was clicking and dragging on the slider to get those values. But actually, when you hold Control and left click, you can turn it into a little dialog box where you can manually enter. I needed to set it to something really high in order for the software to not think I'm screaming. You can see right away when I set it to something crazy like 40, my talk threshold looks pretty normal. When I'm normally speaking, which I am in the video too, I'm voicing over right now, but the same volume, it hangs out around that talk threshold and it will detect when I'm speaking, but it won't see me as super aggressively loud, and that'll be useful when we're talking about loudness effects or having a scream threshold, which we'll go over in a little bit. This next setting here, softmax, is related to the max level. Toggling it on will make it so that I guess you can exceed that max level. The software will account for that. I don't notice a huge difference. It might be because I have my max level so high. But personally, I don't have it toggled on. You might find you have different results turning it on, so try it. Again, F around and find out and see if you notice a big difference. The soft fall setting is pretty cool. In other programs, it might be referred to something like gravity, sort of. What it actually does is it slows down the time it takes for the audio level to fall back down to 0. So you can see the effect directly on the threshold if we start adjusting it, or you can see it in the way that I'm bouncing. It takes longer to get from the higher level that we've reached to the bottom level. Moving this slider up higher makes for a more floaty kind of slow descent and a slow switch between the mouth opening and the mouth closing. Turning it all the way up really boosts that effect. We almost never come back down below the talk threshold. Turning it way, way down makes it so that there's barely a time in between the speaking and the not speaking. So we get kind of this pop, pop, pop. A more energetic, quicker switch between the two states. Depending on what you're doing with physics later and how your physics react to the loudness of your voice, if you have that setting on, the soft fall will have various types of effects. For me, I find most of the time I hang out around this 0.80 mark. Really, it's entirely up to you and the type of vibe you want to give your model. Audio filter is your basic setting for cutting out sounds like your mouse and your keyboard. I have software that I think cuts out most of that built into the mic, but it's not always perfect. So I could find some use in turning it on, but I actually find that more often than not, it won't pick up my voice when I'm being very quiet when I have it on. So I have better results just keeping the audio filter off and dealing with it if the audio filter picks up my mouse and keyboard. This next setting that I'm playing with is compression. Compression is kind of a tricky one to explain, but you can visually see the effect right away. It caps my audio right at that indicator, and it'll change based on your max level. So a lower max level will make that compression cap you at higher on this bar. It's a little bit difficult to explain, like I said, but try it out and see the differences. I don't find very much success having compression on at all because my software thinks I'm being so loud all the time. It's kind of like sticking me at max constantly when I have compression on. RawHeTuber version 13.5 has given us a new audio-related setting. smooth input available on each layer underneath the talk threshold bar that we just spoke about. This setting allows us to individually control how each layer reacts to our audio input levels. While our global audio settings like max level and soft vol will still have their effects on every layer, all of them together, this smooth input setting will give us the ability to further smooth out the audio levels here on this specific layer, so peaks and dips in volume will appear less extreme when it comes to how the layer moves. So the difference will be most noticeable on any layers with an individual motion talking setting. We'll show this in more detail when we get to that part of level 1 in a little bit. So once I was pretty much happy with the audio input settings, I went into these tabs to talk about them a little bit. We first started with this screaming tab. When we have it toggled on, the program will listen for us to reach a certain scream threshold that we can set. This is where those audio settings will come into play and why I was pickier about my max level, because I do want to be able to reach that screaming checkpoint or threshold, but I don't want to be reaching it all the time. This is because there are some really cool effects that we can apply when we reach the scream threshold. Arguably the coolest one is you can swap your sprite to a different image when you reach that threshold. In my case, I didn't really prepare anything for this model to be able to swap to when screaming, so we didn't add a sprite there, but we can toggle it on and add a vibrate effect to kind of like shake when we're yelling, when we're stressed, when we're mad in a game or whatever. I turned the scream threshold way down so we could actually see the effects because I didn't want to actually scream at my mic to be able to trigger it. And then I realized we did have to set a talk sprite in order for it to recognize that our mouth should be open when screaming. And by playing with these vibrate settings right here, you can see that the effect can be kind of wild. So next we got into this blinking tab, and when we're not using that minimal layers toggle, this is actually toggled on by default. In our case, it was toggled off. So when we click it to turn it on, we get this spot where we can add a blinking sprite. So here I added idle blink, and if we watch for a second, we can see that eventually I will blink. I think, maybe. Oh, there we go. So the blink is by default set to a certain randomized delay in between. And in our case, blink while talking is not toggled on, so it will only work when we're idle. When we toggle it on, now we can actually blink while we're speaking too. And in that case, I added this talk blink sprite. So now we have a sprite for when we're talking and blinking. The blink duration is what sets the length of your blink, and the blink delay is the amount of time between your blinks. Adding a variation will make it so that the delay is not always that number that you've set. It'll instead add a randomized variation to that delay. So in this case, because our blink delay is 6 seconds and our variation is 4, what that means is instead of blinking every 6 seconds on the dot, it can be anywhere between 2 seconds, so 6 minus 4, or 10 seconds, 6 plus 4. I mostly keep these settings the same when I'm doing blinking layers like this. I like the effect that it has like this. You can mess around with it if you want different types of blinking looks. The next tab down is this motion inherit tab. We only have one layer, so we can't do anything with this, but to recap what it will be, we can set a parent layer there where it says off. You can select another layer to be the parent, and in that case, any motion that we're applying to that parent will be passed down to this layer. And that's when the physics that we'll set later will come into play. The physics will react to that inherited motion. I know what you're thinking. I like your funny words, Magic Man. This will make sense later as we're doing a more complicated setup. We're not touching motion inherit at all. Lastly, we got to talk about this transform tab. So we can adjust the layers rotation and we can adjust the scale here. Now this sets the original dimensions and position of your layer. So this isn't the same as animation, physics, and motion. This is the base position of your layer. We have a new rotate children toggle here that actually came out in an update, I think today. It'll be useful later for when we do have children set, aka other layers that inherit motion from this layer. and we're trying to rotate everything all together. Right now, it obviously doesn't matter. With the rotation, though, an important note is that we rotate around the pivot point. The pivot point is that little pink dot that you can see moving around as I adjust the sliders to the left. It's a little bit difficult to explain why exactly the pivot point matters so much until we're actually doing our physics later, but I demonstrated just by moving around the pivot point, or moving the pivot point around so we can watch the rotation that I'm manually adding, and we can see the difference in how the layer actually moves around. For the most part, unless you're adding physics to the model, changing the pivot point is not going to matter too much unless you want a different effect as you're inputting your rotation right here. Although it might be, if you're doing multiple layers and you do want to do physics with rotation effect later, it might be best practice to set these pivot points as you go. By default, the pivot point is going to be calculated as just the center of the layer, and it'll matter a lot when you're trying to do rotation physics later, as I'll demonstrate in the more intermediate section of the video. To me, there really is no hard rule for where the pivot point needs to go. There's just kind of a general idea of where it makes sense for the pivot point to be when rotating. I think the rule of thumb that I go with is the spot on the layer that should move the least is going to be where the pivot point is. So where it should move the least when rotating. That isn't always the case, and sometimes it's a little bit hard to understand where exactly the pivot should go. The best way, as usual, is to go around and find out. Just place the pivot point in different spots and rotate your layer to see what happens. Now I'll give you a sneak peek of the mouse tracking settings down here. When we toggle this track mouse on under transform, that's how we get our mouse tracking on the layer. These are the default settings that are automatically populated when we turn on the mouse tracking. If the settings look like they scare you, good. I mean, no, we're going to talk about this later and explain them in depth. This was just to play around so we can see the very basics. We have this new only when visible toggle down here under the transform when we turn on track mouse as well. That will affect things later as we're adding mouse tracking to layers. It doesn't really matter right now. We're not going to keep the mouse tracking anyway. I forgot to talk about this preserve position toggle as well. That affects the pivot point. So when you don't have it toggled on and you're moving the pivot point, it'll actually move the whole layer instead of just the pivot point. I didn't record anything to demonstrate that, but for the most part, I don't have any specific use cases for why you would want to move the whole layer when you're adjusting the pivot point. I think that setting is there because Rahi was worried about existing setups being affected when the method of moving the pivot point changed, because beforehand it would move the whole layer.
Individual
When we don't have a motion inherit set, when it's set to off, we have this individual motion visible by default. Opening this menu will reveal the artists formerly known as bouncing and breathing, aka our talking motion, our idle motion, and our constant motion. Our minimal layer here did not come with these settings being turned on, but the default layers, when you don't have minimal layers on, will have their own individual motion set already. So what do these actually do? Well, under the talking tab, we can select either none, loudness, or regular. I'm button in here really quick in a newer version. This is Future Kip again. In update 13.5, a new option for talking has been added to this drop-down menu. You'll see the once option now. We'll go into detail about all of the settings down here when we talk about loudness, because it's the main one that I use, but once will make your talking motion apply only once as your audio input reaches the layer's talk threshold, and then it will return the layer to its normal position until the next time you speak. In selecting loudness, we can actually already see how it's moving the layer, because by default, this move up value of 80 is applied to the layer as soon as we turn on loudness. All of these boxes here set the maximum that this layer will move when talking. This is a setting that listens to the loudness or the volume of your voice, and it will only reach that maximum move, rotation, or scale, depending on what you've set, when you reach your maximum loudness. So when we're talking more quietly or hanging out around that talk threshold, we're not moving as much as if I were to scream. Using my control and left click, I edited this amount to make it really high. I chose 500 just so we can see exactly what that's doing. Essentially, when I'm not speaking at all, we are not moving, and the louder I am, the more we're moving. Something I forgot to mention is anytime you see these two boxes next to each other, one on the left is going to be your x-axis or horizontal movement, and the one on the right is going to be your vertical or y-axis movement. So we don't have to only move when we're speaking. The motion could also be in the form of a rotation in either direction, or a scale effect, which by default is uniform because we have this constrain toggle set. As soon as we turn that off, we can start adjusting the horizontal and vertical values individually. And then we gotta get this interesting stretch and squash thing happening because the scale is no longer uniform. So the other option we have in terms of talking motion is called regular, and we can pick it in this drop down. So what's happening is it's the same numbers that we can set in the move, rotation, and scale, but instead of it moving in accordance to our volume, it's going to hit that maximum that we've set. In this case, I have vertical move set to 100. Every time it reaches the end of this cycle, the cycle time is set by us down here, and we can slow it down and speed it up. Basically, in one cycle, we go from 0 movement to 100 movement that we have set right there, and it'll restart on loop as long as we're talking. And this will work the exact same with the exact same amount, no matter how loud we're talking. We just have to pass the talk threshold, and it will start that cycle. Personally, I tend to use the loudness setting more often because I like the interactivity of it scaling along with my voice. I think it's really nice. The kind of subtlety that I can get if I'm speaking really quietly is really good. But there are uses for the regular setting, especially when you start splitting your layers and adding individual motion to your layers. There might be certain layers that you want to move the entire time you're talking a set amount. Before I move on from the talking section, let's circle back to talking about the smooth input setting again under the layer settings. With talking motion applied now, we can start to play with that smooth input to see what happens. I'll put a lower max level on in the audio input settings so that we can see more variation in volume as I speak in the talk threshold bar. So as you can see, a lower smooth input value or none makes the talking motion go from no movement to the max value that we set very quickly, bouncing up and down, directly following our variation in volume as I speak. Dialing it up makes it so that the talking motion looks smoother, for lack of a better word. I can still speak quietly. Hang on, maybe I should actually speak quietly. I could still speak quietly or get very loud and reach the screaming threshold if I want to. But the movement between, the animation between those levels is smoothed out. The overall effect on the animation that you get for talking depends on your audio input settings and this setting here if you have smooth input on. So play with different combinations of all of them in order to get the look that you want. So the next individual motion type we'll get into is this idle motion, previously known as breathing. We have the same boxes here for move, rotation, and scale, and they're going to affect the layer pretty much the exact same. By default, we have this 30 vertical move and a scale of 0.10 for both vertical and horizontal. That's just the default. As soon as we turn on idle motion is what we get. We have a cycle time setting again. This will always change the speed of your cycle. This is another case where the motion will go from 0 to whatever number that you set in the box there, according to how fast the cycle goes. So in one cycle, you'll move, in this case, from 0 to 30 on the vertical axis, and will scale out to 0.10 and then come back to 0. This type of motion was called breathing in previous versions because that is the most straightforward way to use it, I think. But I like thinking about it as idle animation because depending on what you're trying to do, you can also use this to get kind of a bounce effect on multiple different layers, which is something I had to create some really scuffed setups for to try to do before we had individual motions. So I'm super happy that it's here, even if I haven't played around too much with it yet. I've mostly only used it for breathing. So while I was yapping, I toggled on this continue whilst talking setting before I did anything else, because I wanted to be able to see what's happening. So now when we have that toggled on, the breathe cycle, or whoops, the idle motion cycle continues even while I'm speaking. I went through and set everything to 0 so that we could change each value manually, and I can show you what some of these other settings do. So we already kind of saw what the vertical move does, but I will turn this up to 100 to demonstrate. And I went ahead and turned off the talking so that that wouldn't interfere with my demonstration. But I added a horizontal move of 100 as well. The positive values that we enter here will, for the horizontal, it'll move us right, and for vertical, it'll move us up. If I switched either of these to negative, it would flip the direction. So here I'm about to change the horizontal to a negative. And we could do that with our left click and control trick. As soon as I did that, now we're moving towards the left because it's a negative 300, and up because it's positive 300 on the vertical. Once I change that to negative, now we're moving down and to the left. So by default, the way that we move horizontally and vertically together is by following this diagonal path, this diagonal line. If we toggle on circular motion, it changes how that movement affects the layer. So we're still only changing this move value, the 300 horizontally and 300 vertically, but now we have a very different effect. We're moving around in a circle, which can have some really cool applications, honestly. I've messed around with this a decent amount and found some interesting effects that you can do by changing the idle motion settings while circular motion is on. This type of motion will also affect our physics later if we have that, so really interesting combinations of things you can do here. I started playing with the scale, and as soon as I did, while circular motion wasn't on, we can see it kind of just makes sense. We hit that maximum scale at the same time that we hit 300 pixels to the right and 300 pixels up. I actually don't know if it's pixels. I just said that, but I don't know what the unit of measurement is. Adding rotation, same kind of deal. It all comes back to 0 and then hits that maximum at the end of the cycle, etc., etc. When we turn circular motion back on and we have this scale, now we get a very different looking effect where it kind of almost looks like we're going around in a 3D circle, sort of like we're coming out at you and then going back. And that's because the scale is following the circular motion too. I'm not sure what the intended effects are of having circular motion on, to be honest, but I find it so cool to look at and play around with. You can see I'm in my F around and find out stage here, where I'm just turning on various settings to see what happens. This is exactly what I want you to do, dear viewer, when you're playing around in RahiTuber. Turn all of these things on, change the numbers, make them extreme, and then turn everything back to default if you don't like what you're working on. The last individual motion setting is constant motion, and we don't have too much under here yet, but it could have some really cool implementations later. All we have right now is rotation speed. So this is a constant motion that's applied no matter what we're doing, whether we're talking or idle. What's going to happen with rotation speed is we will rotate the full 360 degrees and continuously rotate like that without stopping as long as this is on, and all we can adjust is the rotation speed. So when you combine this with things like idle motion and physics and such, you can kind of do some really interesting things. Here I was demonstrating that the rotation on the idle motion is different from the constant motion, because the idle motion's rotation will swing back and forth from the value that you set to 0, whereas constant motion will just continuously rotate. I haven't implemented constant motion like that, the rotation speed, on any of my models yet, but I have ideas for interesting things we can do with that, especially if I can find a cool way for it to combine with that circular motion, idle motion. I don't know yet. If I tinker around with it a whole bunch, I'll probably make that in a separate tutorial.
If you'll kindly oblige with a little appropriate scenery over the sea, let's go, men. We're shoving right off. Again.
Hey, come here. Give me a close-up. A close-up. This is a close-up. A close-up, you jerk. A close-up.
Let's touch on how to capture our model in OBS. It will remain relatively the same process as capturing any other VTuber or PNGTuber avatar, but just in case you're completely new to VTubing, I'll explain the different methods of capture. You can either use a game capture source, a window capture source, or you can get the Spout 2 plugin, link will be below, and add a Spout 2 source. Any of them will work based on your needs, but Spout 2 will most likely be the easiest on your CPU and GPU. RahituBer is lightweight either way, but sometimes OBS can get cranky. Reminder, you can select transparency for RahituBer or set a background color under advanced settings. To use game capture, choose the window you want and be sure to select allow transparency, unless you intend on using a background from RahituBer instead. I might be wrong, but I personally thought that game capture looks slightly lower in quality compared to window and Spout 2 capture sources, so I don't use it often. To use window capture, choose the window you want and select the Windows 10 option, the Windows 10 and up option, if you want transparency. To use a Spout 2 source, install the plugin for OBS and then you'll be able to add a Spout 2 source just like any other one. I'm gonna be honest, I don't know what these settings really are, but selecting the proper window and then making sure that the composite mode dropdown is set to default, or really anything but opaque, will keep transparency if you have that on in RahituBer. Note that Spout 2 source only sees your layers and not anything in the UI. Most of you will probably prefer this method as you can open up your menu and fiddle around with it without OBS or your viewers seeing it. You can hide behind the scenes stuff even more if you go to turn off showing layer bounds in advanced settings. If you do want to be able to show the UI, say if you're working on your model live or in a recording and you want to show your settings, window capture and game capture will both show the UI if you have it docked and opened. You can also choose to show your cursor in OBS's settings for the source if you want. If you're using game or window capture and you do want to hide the behind the scenes stuff from OBS, but you still want to be able to open up your settings, simply pop out the menu with this button near the top of the RahituBer UI and toggle off showing layer bounds in advanced settings. Personally, I prefer Spout 2 when I'm streaming games or normal streams and stuff, and then I'll switch to a window capture when I'm working on things live or I want to demonstrate or yap about my RahituBer setups to chat. Remember that you can have multiple models on your scene at the same time. You can capture more than one RahituBer instance. In fact, I do so pretty often when I want to be able to switch between avatars for a redeem or whatever. Just make sure that name windows separately is turned on under the advanced settings and set your sources windows and OBS accordingly. You've made it so far already, and you've waited so long. I think you deserve a little treat. And if you're here watching my tutorials, I know what you want. Physics, please. A crumb of physics, please. But Kip, teacher cringe devil, you might be saying, didn't you already tell us that we're not doing motion inherit yet? We're not doing physics. I know. But I know some of you might be impatient to start trying some of the cool physics stuff that you've seen in mine and others' RahituBer clips before. And I'm gracious and kind, and also I feel really bad that it's taking me so long. So I'm here to bring you just a little scrap of physics. It'll be like a sneak peek at some of the stuff you can play with before the next part comes out. And no, we won't actually be splitting up the layers at all. We're not going to be touching... we'll be touching the microphone apparently, if you're me. We won't be touching the art. We don't need separated layers for this, so if you have a PNGTuber that you've been using that's just the flat sprites, you could still have a little bit of physics. But how? I am going to have to make myself a liar for this just a little bit, because technically this isn't physics on a one layer setup. This will be 2 layers. I'm sorry, but listen, it's super easy, I promise. allow me to introduce you to one of the newer tricks that I've been using in my builds. Ghost layers. Shout out to Rahisaurus for suggesting a ghost layer as a solution for some of the physics problems I was running into early on in the tutorial project. The general idea of it, though, is using an extra layer that is invisible to our eyes as a parent layer in motion inherit physics, just to be able to give child physics, motion inherit physics, to our visible layer. We're still keeping it super duper simple, which is why I'm getting away with putting it in this part and not level 2. And for now, I want it to be more like an exercise for you to try and follow along with, rather than a full explanation. So, by now, if you've been following along, you should have a pretty simple one-layer setup. All we're going to do is duplicate this layer and move it below our main layer. Now, this copied layer, the newest one, is going to be the parent layer. Our original layer will be the child. We are going to make that new parent layer invisible. You can do this in several different ways, whatever you want, but what you could do is you can turn off the swap with talking, scream, and blinking settings if you have them, and then use the tint setting on the remaining sprite to turn the A, which stands for alpha, value down to 0. Alpha is transparency if you haven't done that before. Or you can delete any sprites from the layer by erasing the links in the text boxes here. Alternatively, you can probably actually just hide the layer. We'll just need to turn off hide with layer under motion inherit settings on the child, which might not make sense to you because I don't know if I talked about hide with parent. Anyway, you could try it. I will be using the tint alpha method. Now let's open up this child layer. Remember that this is the layer we started with, so it has our sprites and all of the individual motion settings that I talked about earlier. They might be slightly different right now because I'm recording this much later, but I'm going to try to use the same settings. The first thing we're going to do is go to motion inherit and then tell this to inherit motion from our new parent layer, the invisible or quote-unquote ghost layer we made. See how a bunch of new settings just popped up right here? That's the physics effect. We now have access to those effects on this layer. A child layer in motion inherit is going to inherit whatever the parent has set for individual motion. This also goes for mouse tracking, but we're not touching that yet. Since the ghost layer was duplicated from our current setup, this new layer also has all of the same individual motion settings that we put on the original before. So then, on the child layer, I'm going back into the motion inherit settings and making sure that individual motion is toggled off. It should be selected by default when we attach a motion inherit parent, but if it isn't, we're going to turn it off right now. Notice though, even though we don't have individual motion on this layer anymore, it appears to be moving. Remember, the ghost layer, the parent layer in our case, still has those individual motion settings on itself. And right now we could change them if we need to, and you can directly see how it affects the child layer, which is the only layer visible right now. Now we're ready to start playing with some of the physics effects under motion inherit. In my earlier explanation, I said that the effects happen as a reaction or a response, I guess, to any motion this layer is inheriting from its parent. We won't go into detail about how these really work until level 2, because it's a lot, it's a doozy. But I do think that for the most part, these different effects, visually, depending on the type of brain and eyeballs you have, will kind of start to make sense in a way as you try them out yourself. I definitely recommend taking this opportunity to try different things and watch what happens. Hello, this is actually voiceover kit. This is the third one that you're hearing in this video, but in my original voiceover for this, I don't think I mentioned it, so I'm just going to make sure that I clarify here. If you're playing with these settings, delay, drag, spring, you might not notice much of an effect right now. That's partially because the parent layer is still invisible to you. If you were to make that parent layer visible again, you can give it a low opacity or bring it back depending on how you made it invisible. You can see the difference in the movement of the child and the parent. And so later we are going to, I'm going to be giving you the kind of the step-by-step to get the jiggle. And I think we'll bring the parent back so we can compare them there too. But just right now, because I originally said I want you to play with things, do that to visualize it more easily, or I think the way that we have it set up, if you've moved your pivot point off of the layer center, you'll be able to see rotation happening and stretch as well. We're going to get more into detail in the later part of this section, and then also in level 2, the motion inherit section, we'll get really in depth about why those effects only work with each other. But yeah, for right now, I recommend moving the pivot point somewhere, just anywhere you want, and then mess around a little bit. And depending on what physics you're putting on it, if you're not seeing much from the idle motion, say you only have idle motion on, try the loudness and try yelling at the microphone and watching the physics react to the bounce. So sorry for the likely over-explanation here. I hope you're watching this on like 2 times speed. That's what I would do. Okay, anyway. And for the sake of not blowing your mind too early, I'm only going to show you a couple of the settings just to do a simple jiggle. We're going to turn Gibby into Jello. To get some version of a jiggle effect, you will want a combination of some drag, some spring, which you want to make sure is higher than your drag setting, and then you can select Preserve Volume in the Stretch drop-down menu to see a little bit of a stretch and squash happen. You might have a good result already just with the default stretch settings, but you can definitely dial these up as much as you want. Remember, you can use Control and left click on any of these boxes and set your own number. So you can really go crazy with this and set this to like 100 and 100 or something if you want to see what it looks like. And then just for clarity's sake, I'm going to go back into the parent layer and I'm going to turn up the opacity a little bit. And I'm going to add a little bit of a tint too. That's just for me to show you so you can see the difference between the original motion of this parent versus what's happening to the one inheriting the motion and applying physics. One thing I will mention though is your results might look different from mine in terms of what the physics look like because of the position of your pivot point. So my other request or recommendation while you're trying out these physics is move the pivot point around while your physics are happening. We're using the idle motion under individual motion, which is going to kind of constantly move, but you can try out the talking setting and let the layer bounce and look at what the physics do there. Or if you're feeling brave, you could turn on mouse tracking on the parent and then shake the model around a little bit and look at the physics. Don't overthink the settings though, because you will get an in-depth guide from me very soon in the next video.
Real smooth.
But my warning to you is that you can and will hypnotize yourself playing with this stuff. It so easily can literally just become Cocomelon. But here we are, ta-da! With minimal effort, we've managed to keep our simple quote-unquote one layer model, but now it just has a bit of extra oomph to it and just one extra little layer, and it's not even visible, so it's fine.
Cha-cha real smooth. Let's go to work. To the left. Take it back now, y'all. 2 hops this time. Right foot to
I did it. Mwah.